Hey there, Achan here, and welcome to another one of my reaction videos. Today I'm going to be reacting to, I could be pronouncing this wrong, Mutter Museum, of the College of Physicians in Philadelphia. I've never even heard of this museum, so I have no idea what to expect. But here we go, let's find out what's at this place. This is a visual tour of this, so.
Hi, and welcome to your tour of the Mutter Museum.
Okay.
Now, really quickly, before we can talk about the Mutter Museum, a brief history about the College of Physicians. Now, the Mutter Museum is part of the College of Physicians of Philadelphia. We're not a degree-granting institution. We're a society of professionals, mainly physicians. We started in 1787, and we're still going strong today. Now, the Mutter Museum came about because in 1858, this handsome gentleman right here, Dr. Thomas Dent Mutter, unfortunately found himself in poor health. He was a fellow here at the college and decided to bequeath his entire teaching collection to us. Now, he did have a few stipulations, one of which was that we had to build a fireproof building to house this collection, which we did, and that opened in 1863. Unfortunately, Dr. Mutter passed in 1859. But his desire that his collection live on as a teaching collection still holds. And we've amassed more collections over the years. And the intent and the use of it is just always been the same as it was over 150 years ago, and that's education. The only thing that's changed is our demographic. If you had come here 40, 50 years ago, almost everybody here would be medical students or physicians. Today, the vast majority of our visitors have no medical background whatsoever, and we love that. So as I guide you through this collection today, keep in mind that we were educating physicians 150 years ago, and we're educating the public today.
So it's basically just the basic anatomy of the body, it looks like.
Behind me, you can see the Hurdle Skull Collection. It's 139 skulls collected by Dr. Joseph Hurdle in the mid-19th century. Now, we acquired this collection over 150 years ago, and it's been one of our most iconic exhibits. In fact, I think it's been on display almost the entire time we've been open. Now, the collection, aside from being very visually interesting, is also very anthropologically and medically interesting, because this is what we call a known population. Now, what do I mean by known population? Well, it means if you look at some of our labels, you can see that in many cases we know a lot of the information about the individual. So we might even know their name, their age, where they were from, and how they died. And for anthropologists, this is very important information because that helps us know more about other unknown populations. So the more we know about certain things, the better it is for us to learn more about the unknown. Now, another interesting thing about this collection is that you can actually visit all of it virtually. We scanned every single one of these skulls, and they're available on something called the Open Research Scan Archive. So scholars from all over the world can access these images for free. Now, the collection here was, again, like I said, collected by Dr. Joseph Hurdle. And there's an interesting story as to why he collected them.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
In the mid-19th century, there was a scientific belief called phrenology. And it basically stated that you could tell a person's intelligence or moral character by certain physical characteristics of the skull, measurements, landmarks, things like that. But Dr. Hurdle did not believe in that. So he wanted to systematically debunk phrenology as a science. So that's why the Hurdle Skull Collection was created. And he was fairly successful in his arguments, so much so that he was forcibly retired from his position at the University of Vienna. And ultimately, his collection came to us. Now, you may notice that there's a bit of an empty spot behind me, and that's because we have a researcher doing some work with some of the skulls behind the scenes in our lab. Now, this exhibit is one of our more recent permanent exhibitions at the college and at the Mutter Museum. It's entitled Our Finest Clothing, a layered history of our human skin. So we talk a little bit about what skin is. And then we also talk about all the different things that we can do to our skin, all of our body modifications, piercings and tattoos, and of course, we have to talk about what can go wrong as well. Now, what's really interesting about this exhibition is it has not one but two specimens from living donors. And in fact, one of those specimens is from our former museum director, Dr. Robert Hicks. He had a skin cancer procedure, and he donated his slides. We actually have an informal friends and family plan. So if you work here, if you're one of our friends, and any bit or piece of you happens to fall off, be removed, we don't ask too many questions, but we would like to have it.
Right?
We also have a jar of picked human skin.
Nobody wants to do that.
So
they just want to look
modern
at
donations,
like, okay,
historical
so
donations, we have it all.
Oh my, look at that one.
Now, many times when people come into the museum, we try to give a basic understanding of the types of collections that we have. For instance, we'll say, if you see a specimen in a jar with fluid, it's a wet specimen. But if you see an object in a jar with no fluid, it's most likely one of our amazing wax models. Now, why do we have wax models when we have these real biological specimens? Well, that is all because of education. When you put a biological specimen in a jar of fluid, in many cases you lose color and texture.
Yeah.
And when you are a dermatologist and you need to make a diagnosis, you need to know those things. These wax models were actually modeled off of people and body parts that had these conditions. So they're incredibly accurate for color and for texture. One of our most famous wax models is actually this individual right here, Madame Dimanche, or the Widow's Sunday. And she has a little something growing out of her, as you can see. Again, this is a wax model, but it was based upon a woman who lived in France. And what she has is something called a cornucutaneum, sometimes known as a human horn, but it is not a horn. It is actually hypergrowth of the keratinaceous layer of your skin. And what we mean by that is the layer of the skin that's responsible for forming nails, hair, things like that. This still occurs today. And in fact, while this is a wax model of Madame Dimanche, right next to her is an actual cornucutaneum removed from a human.
Is it safe to be removed though? I mean, it's not like attached to her actual skull.
Here we have the soap lady. Now, she's called the soap lady because, interestingly enough, she does not represent any genetic or pathological condition. She's actually the result of something called a taphonomic event. And that means she looks the way she does because of something that happened to her after she died. Now, in certain very rare circumstances, when a body goes into the ground, and under very specific conditions, the body fat on that person turns into this waxy, tallowy, soapy-like substance called adipocere. Generally, you need an anaerobic environment, meaning there's no oxygen, and usually a basic pH of the soil. And it helps to have a fairly moist or waterlogged environment, but it's not always necessary. But under those specific conditions, a chemical process will occur, and the body fat will turn into this adipocere. And what that adipocere does is really interesting. One, it forms this protective barrier, but two, and I think this might be one of the more important things, is, well, insects don't like the way adipocere tastes. And insects are really important in that decomposition process. So that's why the soap lady is so relatively intact. Now, what's really interesting, too, is we're not taking any extra special environmental controls with her. She's not in a refrigerated case. She is basically, for lack of a better term, shelf stable. The soap lady has a really interesting story. One of our fellows, Dr. Joseph Leidy, got word that there were being bodies relocated from a cemetery. They were making improvements for the upcoming centennial in Philadelphia. And two of those bodies were these adipocered bodies. And one was a soap lady, and the other was the soap man, who's now at the Smithsonian. Now, Leidy made some specific arrangements to have the bodies brought to him, and he donated the soap lady to us. And she's been with us ever since. Some of the things that people say about her is that she's screaming, and that's not true. Now, remember how I said that she is preserved, but she's not perfectly preserved. So her jaw is dropped open because of the natural decomposition process. Nothing more than that. Another really interesting thing we found out about her, though, is, again, if you look at her mouth, you can see that she's what we call edentulous, meaning there's not a tooth in her mouth. So when she was brought to us, we were told that she was old. But actually, what happened was we did x-rays of her body. You can see some of the x-rays here. And that's when we found out that, in fact, she's not very old at all. In fact, she's pretty young. maybe in her 30s, maybe even younger. So why did she lose all her teeth? Well, dental hygiene wasn't very great back then, but there could be other reasons as well. And so we're actually conducting some scientific tests to see if we can find out a little bit more about her. But we have to be very careful about it because her body is very delicate and we don't want to cause any harm to it. So we have to make sure that we're balancing the preservation of her along with our scientific inquiries.
Poor girl. I feel sorry for her, having to die
Now
like
behind me is the world's largest human colon on display.
That's a
At
colon?
least to our knowledge. If you know of one bigger, please let me know. This one is 8 feet, 4 inches long. It measures about 1.5 feet at its widest diameter, and at the time of death, it held about 40 pounds of fecal material. Now today, it's known as congenital aganglionic megacolon or Hirschsprung's disease. This colon came from an individual who died at the age of 29. However, according to his mother and his doctors, he started exhibiting symptoms at 18 months. And in fact, towards the end of his life, he was only recording 1 bowel movement a month. Now, why is that? Well, it's a congenital condition, meaning it happens when you're forming in utero. And we have something called the alimentary canal, and that's literally an innervated tube that goes from our mouth to our anus. And that entire tube has nerves that cause peristalsis. And that makes everything move along to its natural conclusion. But what happens sometimes, as in the case with Hirschsprung's disease, is that the nerves fail to fully form around one or more sections of the colon or large intestine. Fecal material builds up because the nerves aren't properly moving things along and causing a proper bowel movement. Unfortunately, the purpose of the large intestine is to both hold fecal material and to draw out water. So the longer it's in there, the drier and more compact it becomes and the harder it is to expel. The colon over time slowly starts to get bigger and bigger. It gets more distended. The good news is today it's fairly easily treatable with something called a bowel end-to-end anastomosis. Now kids are diagnosed sometimes just days after birth. They can address this, they can go in and actually cut away the bad uninnervated parts of your colon, sew the good parts together, and then you're good to go, literally. Have you ever wondered where the term Siamese twins comes from?
Yeah,
well, it comes from these two gentlemen right here, Chang and Ang Bunker, who were born in Siam, which is now Thailand. However, we no longer use that term. We use the term conjoined twins now. Now, many people know of Chang and Ang Bunker. They were extremely popular both in the 19th century and even today. And what most people know about them is that they toured with circuses and sideshows. They even worked for a time for the famous or infamous P.T. Barnum. But what a lot of people don't know about Chang and Ang is they did eventually retire from this profession. They bought adjoining farms in Mount Airy, North Carolina. They married sisters, and they had 21 children between them. Now, another thing that's interesting is they didn't always get along. Just because you happen to be attached to your sibling doesn't mean you are the same person. They had lots of different interests and of very distinct personalities. So Chang liked certain beverages, but Ang liked to stay up late at night and play poker. So they came up with a plan. They would spend a couple days at one brother's house with that brother's family, and a couple days at the other brother's house with that brother's family. And whosever house they were at, that's who got to call the shots. And it worked out pretty well for them. However, one day, unfortunately, Chang insisted on going to his house. It was his turn, but it was a dark and stormy January night. And he caught a cold or he caught something. We're not entirely sure how Chang died. He had suffered a stroke previous to this, but we do know that Ang woke up the next day, and unfortunately, Chang did not wake up with him. A doctor was summoned because they did have a plan that if one brother died before the other, they would have emergency separation surgery. But remember, this is the 19th century. There were no four-wheel drive vehicles, and the doctor did not make it in time. And unfortunately, Ang died 3 hours later. After the twins died, their wives granted physicians permission to bring their bodies up here to the College of Physicians for an autopsy.
That's terrible.
And it was here where we found out that the twins not only shared a blood supply, which they knew previous to their death at this band, but they also had conjoined livers. And you can see their livers directly below the casts here. Now, this is a death cast of the twins. It was done after the autopsy, as you can see. But if you look really carefully at the heads, you can see little pieces of their hair still stuck in the plaster. The brothers did have a stipulation that if they died together, they were to stay together. And you can see the physicians honored that request. The incisions go up to the area where they are conjoined, but they never cut them apart. After the autopsy, the bodies were returned to the sisters, and they were buried in Mount Airy, North Carolina.
They had a really tough
Now, this
childhood,
case
then.
here really showcases the extremes, the bell curve, if you will, of human growth, from some of the tallest to not so tall. This is our Mutter American giant. He stands 7 feet 6 inches tall and is the second tallest skeleton on display in the world. Now,
Really?
he
That's
represents
as tall as
a
we get?
pathological condition called pituitary gigantism. So what
His
does that
ribs,
mean?
though, look a little bit
There's two different ways you can be tall.
crooked and smashed,
You can be
it looks like.
genetically tall. So for instance, Yao Ming, who's a basketball player, he's also 7 feet 6 inches tall.
Oh,
But
wow.
our gentleman here would not have been a very good basketball player because he's
Yeah.
pathologically tall. Pituitary gigantism basically means his pituitary gland failed to shut off at the time it should have. And this results in the growth of your skeleton, your muscles, connective tissue. But what it doesn't really result in is the growth of your internal organs to be proportionate. So if you can imagine, this gentleman here probably had the internal organs designed to keep a body around the size of this skeleton maybe. Doesn't work out very well. Very often people with pituitary gigantism die of some sort of heart or lung issue. Now, pituitary gigantism, aside from causing extreme growth, also has very distinct physical characteristics that would differentiate them from somebody who, let's say, is genetically tall. And those are the distended rib cage. The skull is extremely robust, and it's hard to tell with the skeleton, but believe it or not, the hands and feet are actually larger in proportion to the
I
size
see
of the body. And the limbs, the arms and the legs, are also quite elongated. Now, pituitary gigantism still exists to this day, and the
Yep, it
key
sure
is
does.
early intervention. Once you've reached an extreme height, there's really not much doctors can do even today, so early detection is the key. And then what they have to do is basically shut down the pituitary gland, and that can be done by either surgery, medication, or even radiation. Now, on the opposite end of the growth spectrum, we have Mary Ashbury. Mary is a dwarf. There are over 200 different types of dwarfism. One of the most common is achondroplasia, and that's the type of dwarfism that Mary has. Now, achondroplasia has some very specific visual
They also die
characteristics, as
pretty
you can
young,
see in the
too.
skeleton.
They don't have a very long lifespan.
Obviously, aside from being of shorter stature, you can see that the limbs are curved. And in Mary's case, there was one particular element of her skeleton that unfortunately played a key role in her death, and that is her pelvis. Because we know that Mary died trying to give birth. And there's actually two things that were an issue with the pelvis. One, of course, was the birth canal. The opening was just not big enough. But the other issue was the tilt of the pelvis. Unfortunately, the
Yeah, it
tilt of the
does look
pelvis
like
was just incompatible with a vaginal delivery.
Look at that
Today,
skull.
a female dwarf can give birth, but it's almost always via
so
cesarean section. And unfortunately, that was not a viable option for Mary at the time. So she did end up having a cesarean section, but unfortunately she died 3 days later. And if you can imagine undergoing a cesarean section in the 19th century, this was during a time when there was no anesthesia and there was no understanding of antisepsis or germ theory. So they did not wash the instruments, they did not wash their hands. That is
Really?
why cesarean sections had an extremely high mortality rate at
terrible.
that point in time.
We're not that stupid all the way back, were we?
Now here we have Harry Eastlack and Carol Orzel. Both of these individuals had a very, very, very rare condition called FOP, fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva. FOP is what we consider an ultra-rare disease, and in fact, there's only 900 cases diagnosed in the world.
Really?
Now, it's a genetic condition as well, in which bone grows uncontrollably. And it does two things. It forms this almost extra skeleton around the already existing skeleton. But another thing it does is it actually fuses the bones together. So in life, people with FOP are slowly frozen in place. If you look at Harry and Carol, you'll realize that unlike many of the other skeletons that we have in the museum, there's no metal keeping their bones together. That is because they were fused together already in life. Now, FOP is an incurable condition as of right now, but the good news is there are at least 3 drugs in clinical trials that we hope someday will provide treatment for this condition, but unfortunately not available to Harry or to Carol. Now, both of them decided to donate their bodies. Harry passed away in 1973, and he wanted his body to be used to learn more about FOP. He didn't specifically ask to come to the Mutter Museum, but in 1979, he did come here. And what's interesting is that in the 1990s, Carol Roselle, who was a resident of the Ingalls House here in Philadelphia, actually went to an FOP conference where Harry's skeleton was on display. So she actually got to meet Harry's skeleton. And it was there that she made the decision that when she died, she wanted to specifically come here to the Mutter Museum.
Aww.
Now, Carol passed away in February of 2018, and we honored her wishes. It took us almost exactly a year, but in February 28th of 2019, her body, her skeleton specifically, came here to the Mutter Museum.
She does, her
now, Carol
does
had
much
a very
younger
specific condition. She said, if you're going to take my skeleton, you have to also take my bling, her jewelry. So you can see here we have a little bit of a display of some of the over 160 pieces of her jewelry that we also acquired. So Carol was very, very active in education. She was really all about teaching people about FOP. She spoke to medical schools. She spoke to the public. She had lots of experience advocating and educating the public. And we're really happy that we're able to have Carol continuing that mission in death that she did in life.
We have Albert Einstein's brain.
Here's our Einstein case, and you'll notice that we actually have the lights out. Slight technical difficulties, but I still want to mention it. It's important to note that we don't have a large chunk of Einstein's brain. We only have these slides here, which were taken and done shortly after Einstein passed away. And there's actually 5 boxes of these that were created, but only 2 boxes are on display to the public, and we have one of them. Now, what's really interesting is that people have been arguing for years about what it was that made Einstein so intelligent. And many people look to the brain to try and figure that out. But there's a big difference between studying a living brain and studying a dead brain.
Yeah.
And in Einstein's case, with looking at his brain after he died, there's just very little that we can say definitively that would put his brain apart from any others. One interesting thing is it actually was slightly underweight for a male of his size. But another thing that people talked about was that maybe he had more glial cells, or maybe he didn't have a Sylvian fissure. All of these things are debatable. The only thing we can really say with some degree of certainty is that when we looked at these slides, we saw a lack of something called lipofuscin. And lipofuscin is like this plaquey buildup. So you know you can have the plaque build up in your arteries in your heart, or you can also have that happen in your brain. Now, for a person who was in their mid-70s when they passed away, Einstein had remarkably little. But again, we don't know if that was any correlation to his intelligence or not. It's just an interesting fact about his brain. Another thing that's interesting is that this is a relatively recent acquisition. We got this case in 2011. And that's important because we still are actively collecting. We're not able to collect as many things as we used to. We're very, very particular, but we still actively collect. In fact, some of the things I'm very interested in collecting are some of the health aspects that affect us in the 20th and the 21st century. So a lot of the specimens and objects that you see here are really reflective of 19th century public health and health issues, but just know that we're still actively trying to collect specimens and objects that reflect our current understanding and current public health issues as well.
A lot of people seem to go there, though.
Well, we've reached the end of our tour. Not because we don't have more to talk about, but because I was told we're out of time. Your support enables us to
wow, there was a lot in that museum. I am actually glad I got to, visit the museum, even though I haven't left my home, especially in this kind of turmoil that we're currently in right now. I already knew that I've seen pictures of people like conjoined twins, and I didn't really know about the whole bone structure being fused together like that. I didn't know that was a thing. That's actually pretty interesting to find out. What's unfortunate though is that all of these skeletons that we saw, or I saw, um, how tragic their deaths were, and how young some of them were, and the fact that back then, despite how uh, big everybody was with medicinal qualities, and um, how where's my words today? How much doctors were needed, basically. Um, Comparing that to today, I didn't realize that. Well, okay, what am I saying? I know that every day we're learning more and more about more viruses and how to prevent them, and we're learning more about medications today. I just didn't realize how bad it was back then. And I knew that back then we had like the plague and all that other kind of stuff that we had to deal with. But this really opened my eyes to our history and the unfortunate functions that our bodies can sometimes have. And if there's anybody today that is actually watching my video right now and who listened in on the video, if I hadn't cut it out already, I don't know if you've had to experience any of these kinds of things. I'm sorry if you had. There is always a moment for hope, but don't look at this as a bad thing. Look at it as it with hope and positive feelings, because looking back, the way I see it, whenever we look back on history, we usually use history to prevent these things from happening again. I mean, that's why we learn about war and all the other things that happened in our past. We learn about it so then we don't continue it. We don't make the same mistake twice, right? It's the same thing when it comes to our health. We learn about our health in the past so then we can prevent it from happening again. So then we can live longer and strive and reach higher goals and everything. At least that's how I see it. This video was actually quite informational, and I didn't expect this to. It wasn't even scary to me. I actually have a strong affinity with skulls and stuff. If I was that one guy who was collecting skulls, I'd probably do it too. I don't know why I love it. But I'm actually really thankful that my friend had requested this for me to watch. I liked it. So let me know what else you guys would like me to watch. This is actually pretty interesting. It doesn't have to be music. It can be something informational like this. I may have graduated from school, but hey, I love learning more things. I'm like a child from long ago. A child is always inquisitive about things, always wanting to know more. And why should we stop learning more after we graduate from school, right? So yeah, let me know what you want me to watch, and I'll see what I can do. Thanks for watching, guys. Bye-bye.